David Limbaugh is with us. He has a new book out. It's called Bankrupt, the intellectual and moral bankruptcy of today's Democratic Party. David Limbaugh, a lawyer, a columnist, the brother of Rush Limbaugh, and living in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. I understand it's a beautiful place, David.
Thank you. How are you?
I'm great. I'm fine. Your book suggests that the Democratic Party is purposefully undermining this nation for the sake of advancing their liberal agenda. Let's deconstruct those two.
For the sake of advancing their partisan agenda.
Well, actually, I'm reading from the PR piece that you sent to us.
I didn't write that. I mean, whatever. But anyway, that's close enough.
Yeah, all right. Purposefully undermining the nation. How?
Well, they're subordinating the national interest, is the way I prefer to call it, to their partisan interest. They're undermining President Bush's prosecution of the war on terror at every turn.
Well, for example.
Pardon?
Give me an example.
They mischaracterize his NSA terrorist tracking program as domestic spying, when it always involves an international party to the conversation or communication. It always involves a terrorist or suspected terrorist. It is not a law enforcement matter. It is used to prevent terrorist attacks. It has prevented terrorist attacks. And
are you suggesting that George W. Bush spying on folks who are engaged in international communications, which is provided for under the FISA Act, where he does, he can go 3 days before he goes to the FISA court, that he should be allowed to break the law?
Well, I don't accept the premise of your question. I don't think he is breaking the law.
Well, a court has ruled that he broke the law.
One court has ruled, a very partisan court. We'll see how it turns out. The court could go either way. I don't know. Well,
are you familiar with the law, David Limbaugh?
Yes.
Okay.
The argument.
How can you argue that he didn't break the law?
You got to let me talk now. If you're going to have a debate with me, you got to let me talk.
I didn't think I wasn't.
Well, we're not talking about. I don't believe that he did break the law. He doesn't believe he broke the law. His Attorney General doesn't believe that he broke the law, that he has inherent constitutional authority and congressional authority to conduct these warrantless searches, and they don't believe it would be practical to do it otherwise.
Actually, isn't the argument not that he didn't break the law, but that the law doesn't apply to him?
No.
Because of that inherent presidential authority?
Well, I mean,
because the law specifically says that any federal officer, the law says that's the language of the law, any federal officer who engages in surveillance must obtain within 3 days of the initiation of that surveillance a warrant from a FISA court. And he's a federal officer, and he failed to do that.
If the law doesn't apply to him, he's obviously not breaking it. But his position is that he has the inherent authority to do it. Retired FISA judges have agreed that he has inherent constitutional authority to do it. And there's an ongoing debate about it. But for you guys to act like it's a cut-and-dried case where he's deliberately trying to consolidate executive authority and aggregate power at the expense of the legislative branch, I think is, again, misrepresentation. He's trying to prevent future attacks. What motive would he have to not comply with a warrant requirement if he believed there were a warrant requirement? He's trying to prevent attacks. He's not trying to prosecute criminals, suspected drug enforcement guys.
Well, it's a really good question, David Limbaugh. And by the way, website davidlimbaugh.com and his new book Bankrupt. It's a really good question, and I think that Richard Nixon answered it for us. Richard Nixon broke that. The law didn't exist at the time. The law came about as a result of Nixon. Nixon said, I've got the FBI and the CIA spying, and I'm not going to tell you who they're spying on, and I'm going to do it without a warrant, and I'm not going to notify a court. And it turned out that the reason why he was doing it was because he was spying on his political opponents. How do Democrats know that George W. I thought you were going to let me finish your sentence. How do Democrats know that George W. Bush isn't doing the exact same thing that was being done out of Republican offices in the Senate when they were spying on when they hacked into Ted Kennedy's computer? How do we know that he's not wiretapping us?
Well, if he is wiretapping us, there's remedies for it, and a guy can wiretap you. If you say he's going to break a law, he can break it without even talking about it. So I mean, I've never understood that argument. A guy can violate the law all he wants to if he can get away with it. But we're talking about NSA people. We don't have the manpower to monitor little old ladies, and we don't have the motive or incentive to do it. We're talking about, and there have been no victims, no known victims. Senator Feinstein has admitted that. No victims of the Patriot Act. We're talking about prosecutorial tools that the Democrats are instinctively against.
If Hillary Clinton was president, if Hillary Clinton was president, would you want her to have the power to wiretap you without having to go to a court and demonstrate that there's some good reason to?
If I am suspected to be talking to a suspected terrorist, yes.
In Hillary Clinton's mind, not in the mind of a judge, but simply in her mind, then you think that she should be able to wiretap you.
It's not in her mind. She'd have to have a reasonable basis for it, and I would have a remedy.
But she would be the person who would determine what that reasonable basis was. And no, you wouldn't have a remedy because you'd never know about it.
Listen, Tom, it's not an irreversible situation. If I found out that was occurring, I could take remedial action legally against her.
How are you going to find out?
Well, I don't know.
She's the president. She runs the executive branch.
Listen, how are you going to find out if anybody breaks the law doing anything? You're not. But we're getting bogged down.
Well, that's the reason why we have laws that prevent people from engaging in an activity where
reasonable people disagree as to that law.
Okay, then if reasonable people are disagreeing, David Limbaugh, why do you say that Democrats are purposefully undermining the nation by having this discussion?
Because I think their purpose in preventing the enforcement of this act is to gain partisan points against President Bush.
My purpose in arguing for the enforcement of this act is to make sure that Hillary Clinton isn't listening on you and your brother.
No, I understand that people like you can have a reasonable position on this. I'm talking about the Democratic leadership. That's what I believe. Now, let me give you some other examples so that I can build my case.
Okay, we just have 30 seconds. David.
Well, look how they've lied about Bush lying about WMD. They've lied about him saying Saddam was involved in 9/11 when he explicitly said otherwise. They've lied about him saying there was an operational relationship. They've lied about saying he's a unilateralist when he got 32 nations and begged other nations to join the coalition, which a unilateralist wouldn't have done. They have lied about him committing torture by policy at Gitmo when he hasn't, and when he punishes people.
Do you think that any of those arguments are gonna fly with anybody outside of the Republican base?
Well, I absolutely do. I absolutely do.